Hello, I'm Lynne Edwards and I'm a quilt maker, and I'm going to show you how to bind your quilts, especially if the angles of your quilts are not just a straightforward 90 degrees but some other strange angle. Here is a small piece here. Now this has got your 90 degrees square corners, but these are really 135 degrees. Trust me, that's what they are. And that is not an easy angle to put binding round if you would like to for the edge of your quilt. Here's a much larger piece, which is a Christmas table centre. It could also, of course, be used as a tree skirt. And here, the corners, the angles of all those corners, not 90 degrees, 120. That also is not an easy angle to actually cope with when you're going to put binding on. So we have a Creative Grids ruler which will do the job. So let's have a look at the ruler. Here's the ruler. It's called an angle finder and it has 5 corners to it. There's your regular 90-degree corner that you have not on most corners of quilts. This is the wider one, the 135. This one was on that little piece that I showed you. At this end we have the 60-degree, very sharp pointy one, and its companion really, that 120. That was on the hexagonal quilt that I showed you, the Christmas quilt. All of those are going to be used for doing corners of all these different shapes, and I'm going to show you how. Now if you do regular continuous binding, you're going to go all the way around the edge, and somewhere or other you have to actually link those two ends, and sometimes that can look quite awkward. This is an alternative way of doing it. I'm dealing with just squares at the moment because I think this might be very useful for you. It will give mitered corners, but there'll be no extra little joining part. To begin with, as always, here's my quilt top. Here's my wadding and my backing 1/4 of an inch bigger on all 4 sides. But you can probably see here that I have done something additionally. I have in the corner of the quilt marked with a dot 1/4 of an inch in. Looking closer, I've made that dot with a pencil, which is 1/4 of an inch from that side of the quilt and 1/4 of an inch from the top of the quilt. Exactly in that position, and I've done that on every corner. The binding strips themselves need to be the length of the quilt plus a good 2 inches, an inch for either side. The binding strip is cut 2.5 inches wide to the length you need for each side, folded in half and pressed with the right sides outside. Here's the quilt with the 4 binding strips stitched on. If I pull this one back, we can see the line of stitching 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the quilt, and you can see where it finishes right on that dot. We can look at that a little more closely. The stitching has finished right on the dot, and we can check this out by if we fold this back, pull it back, and pull the adjacent one back. They shouldn't overlap at all. They should actually both meet right on that dot. Now when I'm sewing this, here's a tip for you. I pin it on, and I need to know where to stop sewing. So I will actually fold the binding back on the dot and crease it firmly. I'll open it again, and where that crease mark is, I'll pin, so that when I'm stitching, I stitch along to the pin and I know when to stop. And I'll come back a couple of stitches, put my machine into reverse, so that the stitches won't come undone later. And I've finished it. You do that on every corner and you won't get any nasty overlapping pieces. Now we've got the binding strips on, we need to actually make one of those mitered corners. So first of all, taking one of the corners, fold the quilt over, pulling the binding strips across like that so they match. Push the quilt itself away on both sides so these strips of binding match beautifully, and pin it. So I've pinned the binding and I've pushed the quilt well out of the way, including the seam allowances. Now this is where the ruler comes in. Now on the ruler there is a 90-degree corner, and we're going to use it now no matter what angle we're making on our quilt, because the left hand side of the ruler goes alongside the stitching, and we're going to draw a line along the top so it's going right from the end of the stitching to the end of the binding, along like that. If you've got dark fabric, you better use a white pencil. Now that line is going to be the same whether you're doing a 90-degree corner or anything. Let me show you. On the ruler here, I'm going to put that on there, there's a line, and it's 1 inch long, pretty well, and that sits on, and there's an angle beyond it. Now every single corner, doesn't matter what the angle is, has that inch-wide line. Even the 60-degree, very long pointy bit, but it's still linked. So whatever size corner you're doing, you still have to do that line on everything. Once you've done that line, I'm going to go back, of course, to what I'm doing, which is a 90-degree one. Put the line on. Now what I tend to do is I will actually slide the ruler so I just see that pencil line, because when you draw alongside something, you always increase the size slightly. So I just put it down slightly, and then I will draw along there and down there. So here's the line drawn in. That's a 90-degree shape. When you stitch, take this to the machine or by hand, whichever you prefer. Stitch not along the straight line there, just the angle at the end. That will be stitched, not that. So I've stitched my angle 90 degrees, and then I've trimmed the seam allowance 1/4 inch, including right across the top like that, which is in fact a mean 1/4 inch. Once I've trimmed that, we're ready to actually turn the binding and make the mitre. So I'm going to pick it up and place it down this way, like this. Now the ruler comes in useful here too. 90 degrees is what we're doing. I'm going to place it over the binding like that, over the quilt, sorry, like that. And then over this is going to come, pull it over, look at that, like shrugging yourself into an overcoat. Push it nicely into the corner. Now if you can't get a perfect point, this is what I do. I take it out and I use the 60 degree, which is wonderful because it's very pointy. Push it in and tweak the corner, like so, till you get it really nice. Push the seam allowances whichever way they want to go to be comfortable. And there we've got a mitre on the back and a mitre on the front. But I don't want you thinking that that works beautifully just because it's a simple 90 degree. I need to show you one of the wider angles as well. And in fact, the wider angles are easier. This is 135 degrees. I've set it to the stage of putting the binding on, sewing the angle, and in fact you can see there the seam that I made, that I trimmed down to 1/4 inch, I've finger pressed it open. You can do that with the wider angle. The wider the angle, the easier it is. So now I'm ready to actually turn it. So here's the ruler, 135 degrees in the corner, and I'm just able to pull this over. Look at that, piece of cake. And what we get is 135 degrees on the back and 135 degrees on the front. How clever is that? Well, I hope I've taken some of the fear out of putting binding on your quilts for you, including some of those strange angles, which are very daunting otherwise. Enjoy using the ruler and enjoy making your quilts.